All right, draw a line in your notes here because what we're going to talk about today, is actually going to go on your next test. So this is really where we begin kind of taking a look at the Unit 2 material, okay? And basically the end of Chapter 4 and the beginning, really, and Chapter 5, all of Chapter 5 are about the American Revolution, okay? The little bit of Chapter 4 is about the lead up to it, and then Chapter 5 talks a lot about the causes, the conduct, consequences of the American Revolution. So as we get going and as we start thinking about the beginnings of the American Revolution, we've got a couple of questions that you are need to think about as we go through this. Okay. So one is this: was the American Revolution inevitable? Okay. Was the American Revolution always going to happen? Or does something in the aftermath, perhaps, of the French and Indian War, is there something that triggers what becomes the American Revolution? Were there decisions that were made that triggered the American Revolution? Or was it always going to happen? We've got to kind of answer that. Okay. Two, was the American Revolution a true revolution? All right, we might as well get to this right now. Okay. Somebody tell me what the definition of revolution is. When we say the French Revolution or the American Revolution, what does revolution mean? Crickets. Come on. You hear this term all the time. What does it mean? Change. Usually in a short period of time. Radical, sometimes violent, political, or social change, usually in a short period of time. So when we say the American Revolution, we are arguing that at some particular moment in time, the Americans will foment a violent and social, political change in a relatively short period of time. Is that really what happens? Or, okay, is it this? A war for independence, which is different. Okay. Revolution means political, social, cultural change, usually in a short period of time. War for independence is something totally different. It's we like you, but we just can't be governed by you anymore. So which one is it? Okay. And we'll have to figure that out for ourselves. Okay. And it's tough. There have been a lot of books written about this. Okay. Was the American Revolution a true revolution? Was it a war for independence? Okay. Was it inevitable? Was it always going to happen? Okay. And we have to kind of figure out which one of these is right. One of the first things to start looking at are causes. One of the first things we have to search out really are what are the causes of the American Revolution. There are many, and there are some that are hotly debated. Okay, still. No one will question this, though: the aftermath of the French and Indian War. The aftermath of the French and Indian War, 1763 is a turning point. When the British defeat the French in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, when the map changes to that, where the two major landholders in North America are now the British and the Spanish, and the French have been really booted out to only that minor little colony down there where Haiti is today. The French are the big losers. They've lost everything. The British have gained tons of new land, okay, but they've also inherited a lot of problems. There are Native American problems, there are French problems, there are colonial problems that the British have either ignored for a long period of time or don't really know how to solve. And in the aftermath of 1763, if you look up here, you notice that they now have a tremendous amount of territory, new territory, that they have to govern. How can they do it? Okay. This convinces the British, it convinces the British government, okay, that they have to make some changes, okay? Because of this increased colonial empire, because of a huge debt now that the British have had to endure because of constant warfare during the 1700s, which is expensive. Okay? The British are broke. They are in debt. The last thing they want is another war. Okay? So they need the Americans to start producing. They need the Americans to start trading. They need the Americans to get back on track economically to help the British get back on track economically. And they're even going to start contemplating the idea of asking the Americans to start paying for some of the costs associated with the British maintaining this world empire. The British also come away from the French and Indian War with a true lack of respect for the American colonists. They don't like us. The British Army feels that the American colonies or the American colonial militias, for example, are pathetic. They're poorly trained. They're poorly equipped. They don't fight very well. Now, in truth, what they didn't do is they didn't fight like the British. The American colonists have adapted to warfare in the Americas. You're not fighting other European powers. You're not fighting other European armies. You're fighting Native Americans. And so they have adapted their way of warfare. The British found it to be crude and bad. They just didn't like it. Go back to what I told you about Braddock. Braddock leads this British army out into the wilderness to go and attack Fort Duquesne. If you watch the video, Braddock gets them out there, gets them ambushed, gets killed, okay? And it's up to Washington to lead the retreat back. All the while, Washington was advising him, hey, we're in trouble here. This isn't good. We're going to get ambushed. Washington looks like a prophet. It didn't take it. Washington knew. He knew how the French and the Native Americans had fought. He's one of the few American colonists in 1755 that actually had encountered the French and the Native Americans and battled them and lived to tell about it. So the British, though, view us as poorly trained, okay, and not much of a threat. To make matters worse, they also viewed us as hostile. We had not helped out the British a whole lot during the French and Indian War. They had asked us to do certain things, and we had not really done a whole lot of it. So they come away from this with a newfound disrespect for us. Don't worry, it goes both ways, okay? It goes both ways, okay? We come away with some pretty bitter feelings towards the British. And in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, all that is going to intensify. It's going to get worse, okay? A lot worse because of some of the decisions that the British make. But, okay, it does, for the first time, start to bring 13 very different colonies together in the face of a common enemy. French and Indian War was the British and the American colonists against the French and the Indians. They're Indian allies. So, if you remember back in 1754, I told you that Ben Franklin had proposed the first real attempt to unify some of the colonies. Excuse me, the Albany Plan of Union, to bring some of those colonies together to fight together against a common enemy. They come away from this, the colonies they've built some bridges between themselves. They've learned to communicate with one another. They've made contacts with one another. And so now people in New England, in Massachusetts, or in Rhode Island, they know who Ben Franklin is in Pennsylvania. And other people are starting to make contacts with people who are like mind. And that is going to be important during the early days of the American resistance. Okay? So each side has come away from the French and Indian War with some galvanized new feelings, some strange sort of new thoughts about the post-war world and how it should be. I told you guys that the British felt like one of the worst things that could happen was another war. And when the war was over, when the French and Indian War was over, and the French and the British had negotiated the Peace of Paris, there were a lot of Native Americans who weren't happy about the ending of the war. More importantly, they didn't take part in the Peace of Paris, and so they had no real belief that the war was over. So Chief Pontiac, who was the chief of a group of Native American tribes around the Great Lakes region, took to the battlefield and attacked many of the forts in and around the Great Lakes. Okay, so if you look at the map up here, you can see many of these forts came under attack by Pontiac and Pontiac's forces. Now, Pontiac's rebellion will be viciously put down. The British will end it pretty quickly. One of the things they did was send smallpox infected blankets to the Native Americans, okay, that germ warfare. But it convinced the British in 1763 that they had to take some steps to solve some of the tension here and to keep the Americans from causing another war. Okay. All right, I'm gonna go back to this map for a second because it's bigger and I want you to see what I'm talking about. What the British were so afraid of was that the Americans, who were already pushing out here into the Ohio River Valley after new land. How do we know that? George Washington, remember? So many of these colonies were already trying to push their boundaries westward. What the British were afraid of is that they pushed their boundaries, the colonists pushed their boundaries westward, they're going to run into hostile Native Americans, See Pontiac's rebellion. Hostile French forces that haven't evacuated yet, which is always a possibility. A combination of both, that these guys are going to push westward and get out there and cause another war. So how do you prevent that? How do you keep the colonists from doing that? If you're the British and you're the British government, your parliament, how do you prevent that from happening? You don't want it to happen. You can't afford for it to happen. So how do you prevent it? Number one, you put a boundary up. That red line is the proclamation line of 1763. It's a boundary. Artificial, but it's a boundary. King takes out his marker, draws the boundary on there and says, Parliament, I want you guys to make sure that nobody settles west of this line. Okay, so the Royal Proclamation Act of 1763 put that boundary into place and made it to where the American colonists could not settle west of that land, or west of that line, sorry. Okay. How do you enforce it? That's a big line, right? There's a lot of territory there. So, how do you enforce it? The British have to do something that, one, is very expensive, and two, is not very popular for either side involved. The British are going to have to leave an army here, a standing army. They've never done that before, but the British are going to have to leave an army here under the command of Thomas Gage, a British general. Gage is in what a terrible situation, okay? You have a British army stationed here, okay? You're in hostile territory no matter where you go. Hey, these guys are British colonists, right? They are British colonists. They should love having the army there to protect them, right? No. Why? Nobody wants an army camped out in your backyard. The American colonists think a little differently now. Think about what's happened. They put this line in place. Now, what's the army there to do? Deny them the opportunity to move west, to get new land. They're here to control us. They're not here to protect us. They're here to make our lives miserable. So Gage is really in a bad spot here. This is the first time really the British have had to deal with leaving a standing army somewhere. The American colonists are like, the war's over, why doesn't the army go home? And the only answer is they're here to enforce things. They're here to make our lives miserable. They're here to make us do stuff that we don't want to. It's expensive. Standing army is expensive. And so I told you the British are broke. So how do you afford to keep a standing army in a foreign country or foreign land and still pay for it? Okay? Easy. I told you guys that the British are starting to rethink how they're going to administer their empire. Now, this dates back even to before the end of the French and Indian War. The British were already starting to rethink their views on the American colonies. And in fact, what they sort of realized is that they'd let the American colonies get away with stuff for far too long. Okay? It's like your parents buying you a Corvette, and all of a sudden you get 5 tickets, okay, in the first week. They better rein you in, right? Or you're going to go to jail, right? So the British realize, hey, we've made a mistake here. We've let the colonists trade with whoever they wanted to. We've let the colonists smuggle, because remember, technically trading with the French or trading with the Spanish was illegal. The Navigation Acts date all the way back to the 1650s. And so the Americans should know better, but there's no one there to enforce it. And so they traded with whoever the hell they wanted to, because there's no one there to tell them no. Now, all of a sudden, the British realize, hey, we're broke. We need some money. These Americans are going to have to start toeing the line. And so in 1761, as early as 1761, Parliament had passed a series of laws, or series, they're more like decrees than anything, but they're laws, technically, called the Writs of Assistance. Okay? Writs are like orders. Okay? Basically, what the writs did, these writs of assistance allowed the British Army and British officials to come into your home, to board your ship, if you owned one, to go into your warehouse, to search your property without a warrant. Okay? It gave them extraordinary powers to search out and to search property and other things, okay, without warrants. All in the name of stamping out smuggling. Okay? Well, in places that were good at shipping and at trade, like, for example, Massachusetts, they hate these things. They hate them. Okay? And so, in Massachusetts, some of the people who really didn't like these writs of assistance, guys like John Adams, who you're going to hear a lot more about, will go to a lawyer named James Otis. Now, you're probably sitting out there going, who is James Otis? Okay. James Otis had graduated from Harvard. By 1760, he was one of the top lawyers in Massachusetts. Brilliant. Okay. A brilliant lawyer. Now, John Adams was a lawyer. Okay, John Adams and his legal team later on, okay, Josiah Quincy, will defend British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. So John Adams is no slouch when it comes to the law. He can't touch Otis. Otis is way up there. Okay, Otis had been even appointed to some special sort of legal status, really, inside of Massachusetts to argue really high-level cases. Otis considered himself to be a British citizen. He's not one of these guys that is running around saying, wait a minute, we can't have this, okay? We're going to call those guys patriots later on. But he's not one of those guys, okay? He kind of considered himself to be just a regular old British citizen. But he did not like the writs of assistance. He felt like it violated hundreds of years of British common law. It violated everything from the Magna Carta in 1215 all of these parliamentary precedents protecting personal property. Okay? And so he argues against the writs of assistance, okay? Saying, look, you guys can't just come over here and start violating hundreds of years of legal precedents all in the name of controlling smuggling. If you want to search people's homes, get a warrant. That's what the law says, okay? So basically, he says, look, all of this evidence, these hundreds of years of legal precedent, should trump this dumb act that you've put out there, okay? He loses, okay? He loses. British courts will rule that parliamentary law and legal custom have equal weight. Okay, all right, big deal. Okay, this is a beginning. Think about the American perspective here. Okay, these guys are here, they're throwing their weight around, they're violating all of the laws, and they're running us over. We try to do the right thing. What happens? Lose, because they're stacking the deck against us. There's Otis. Okay. One of Otis's most famous statements that emerges out of this kind of debate, especially when we start moving to the next phase, taxation without representation is tyranny. Now, the Patriots will morph that into what? No taxation without representation, which becomes one of the major battle cries of the American Revolution. But Otis is important here because taxation without representation is what? Tyranny. Okay, here's another chance. Okay, here's one of those ACT words you should have learned, all right, before you took the ACT. Okay, what's tyranny? One of those vocabulary words everybody needs to know. Nobody knows what tyranny is. Tyranny is ruled by a tyrant. Okay, where it gets its name from. If I call you a tyrant, does that give you a warm, fuzzy feeling? No, and we usually associate tyrannical rule with dictatorial rule, okay, despotic rule, okay. Tyrants are usually bad news. They rule for themselves. They rule without really concern for the people that they rule. Their only interest is staying in power, okay. So when Otis says this, think about it. He considered himself to be what? British citizen, right? But then he starts to think about some of these things. And you'll start seeing some of the more educated people. If you watch the videos that I put up, okay, one of the things I talked about was the Enlightenment. All these guys, I told you about Otis. Otis is a brilliant guy. And as the Enlightenment gets going, a lot of them start looking around and say, wait a minute, is this really the best form of government? Is this really the best that we can do? Okay. All right. In the wake of all this, we get some decisions made by the British to start trying to heal the breach. Okay. In other words, the British are starting to try to find out how they can refill their bank account. And so starting in 1763, under the leadership of George Grenville, who is really prime minister, Grenville will launch a program designed to start making the Americans pay for some of their own defense. Okay, one. Grenville takes a look at some of these things and says, well, what we can do is we can start making the Americans do what they should always have been doing. Okay, we're going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts. They should only be trading with British ships. They should only be trading with British crews. They should only be buying British products. Okay, so we're going to force them back under the Navigation Acts. The Sugar Act is a good example of that. Okay. Now, technically, what the Sugar Act did was it actually lowered the duties on sugar, but it reinforced the provisions about making sure that the Americans bought sugar and shipped sugar products only to England. Okay. The Currency Act, you know how things change. I want to kind of throw that one out there too. Currency Act used to be viewed as one of the major causes of the American Revolution. It's not anymore. But Grenville made it to where the British agents, British tax collectors, British ship captains, all right, the British East India Company, when it gets around, had to be paid in British money, not in colonial money. Okay? Why? Because the colonies could devalue their currency. They could just start printing currency and make it worthless, right? And so instead of allowing them to do that, you had to pay in British currency. Made it more difficult for the Americans to conduct trade, made it more expensive. And thus, of course, those duties get paid back to the English in British pounds or in British currency rather than American currency. The next two are really a direct result of the French and Indian War. Okay, these two are all about trade. Okay, that's all about trade. So that's the Navigation Acts. Put the American colonies back under the Navigation Acts where they should have been already. We enforce those, we're going to give money back. Okay, everybody agree with that? Well, that takes time though. What's the other way a government can raise revenue and raise revenue in a hurry? What did Otis not support, for example? Taxation without representation. Taxes. It's the easiest way a government can raise money. Does our government tax you? Of course it does. Local governments tax you, state governments tax you, federal governments tax you, and everything that you do. You just don't realize it. Are you taxed when you buy gas? Yes. Are you taxed when you buy anything at the store? Yes. Are you taxed when you buy a house? Are you taxed when you buy a property? Are you taxed when you get your paycheck? Okay. So the British government decides on a program of taxation. Okay. And a lot of this is going to come right out of the French and Indian War. Whoops, wrong way. Hit the right button, dummy. Come on. There you go. The third one that's part of Grenville's program is a Quartering Act. All right, put a star by this. This is the first Quartering Act. There actually will be another one later on. Okay. When you say quartering, you are saying essentially that when we talk about it militarily, it's feeding and housing troops. Okay, they're quarters. Okay. The Quartering Act required the colonies to feed and house British troops stationed in America. Now, the first Quartering Act was a little bit milder than the Quartering Act that will come later on. First Quartering Act simply required the colonies and the colonial governments to feed and house British troops staying in their colony. Vacant homes, vacant businesses, vacant stables, places, public houses, things like that could be used to house the British troops. And it was the colony's responsibility to not only house them, but feed them. Remember, what are the British trying to do? They're broke. They're trying to find the Americans a way to pay for some of their own defense. Okay. And so one of the things that the British are going to try to do is defray the cost of getting all of these troops and keeping them over here by making us pay for some of it. This goes over like a lead balloon. Okay. We don't want the troops over here in the first place. So why would we then try to, pay for them? Okay. It'll get much worse. Which is why, by the way, when you get to the Bill of Rights, what's the third of the Bill of Rights? Government should not make any American do what? Quarter troops. Okay. All goes back to that. They hated it. What's the Stamp Act? Anybody know? This is one that you better know, because the Stamp Act is the first direct tax on the American colonists. So Grenville says, we are now going to tax the Americans. Okay. First, let's talk about what a Stamp Act is. Essentially, a Stamp Act is a tax on paper. Okay? It's a tax on paper. Anything to do with paper. Paper products, anything made from paper like playing cards, newspapers, pamphlets, okay, are all taxed based on the Stamp Act. Legal documents had to, in order for them to be legal, also had to have the tax paid. Okay, so if you needed a deed, if you needed a will, then to get that to be official, you not only had to seek out a lawyer, but you also had to pay the tax. Okay, so it is essentially a tax on paper. If you lived in England in 1765, one of the taxes that you paid living in England was a stamp tax. Okay, so this is not new. This is not just for the Americans. Okay, it existed, and if you were a British subject living at home in England, you paid a stamp tax. Okay. When word of the Stamp Act comes down, the Americans and American colonists, some of them, will pitch a fit. One of the biggest problems, and this one is really theoretical, so you're going to have to kind of pay attention with me here, okay? It goes back to what Otis was saying, okay? It goes back to what Otis was saying. Taxation without representation is tyranny. We, the American colonies, and guys like Otis are going to argue that a Stamp Act or any direct tax on us should be illegal. Why? We do not have a representative in Parliament. Okay? If you're at home in England and you're paying the stamp tax, you pay it because what? Parliament represents you because your district or your town has a representative in Parliament. Okay? That's one theory, or that's one theory. Okay? So we pay taxes, or we should pay taxes, if we have a representative. There is no American representative in Parliament, right? None. So any tax that Parliament puts on us is illegal. Parliament, though, has a different idea. It's this idea of what kind of representation does Parliament have over us? And it's very theoretical. You got to kind of follow along with me. Parliament argues that it represents every British citizen virtually. No matter what, actually, that term actually makes a whole lot more sense now than it probably did in 1765. Give you an example. Let's flip it. Okay? Let's flip it. You get a job in England. Okay? American, think of yourself as an American, soccer star or whatever. Okay? So you get a job in England playing soccer. You live in England. You work in England, right? Are you an English citizen? No. Does Parliament represent you? No. But when you are there, and when you are earning money in England, what's happening? You're paying taxes, right? You have a home back here in America, okay, here in Mississippi. You're not living here, but you still own that property. Do you have to pay taxes on it? Yes. Okay. And so what America would say is, hey, even though you're over there, you still have a presence here, and what? We tax you because you still own property here. Okay? So what Parliament is saying to the American colonists is what? We know you're over there, dummies. We sent you over there. You're still what? You're still a British citizen. You chose to go over there. But we still represent what? All British citizens, no matter where you are. And so what? You got to pay taxes. And what do we say? Okay. Boy, we're on different tracks now. Okay. This is argued by Parliament, and we're like, no way. Okay. Think about what I told you, no taxation without representation. You give us a representative, then what? We'll pay taxes. We're good. You don't give us a representative, then you go back to the right. It's a big difference. When Grenville puts out the Stamp Act, okay, which by the way, every British citizen paid, if you were at home, we react horribly because of this. Okay. How could the colonies pay taxes to a body that they don't have a representative in? Why do they pay taxes to their own colonies? They did. Because they had representation in those bodies. But they're not going to go along with this. Or at least they say they're not. Okay. And what we end up with is a Stamp Act crisis. All right, we'll stop there. Okay. And we'll pick this up. All right, make sure that you have watched the video, okay, and you know what to do with your exam. We're basically going to go paperless for this first exam. So the instructions are up there in that video. All right, go and look at it. Some of you already started working on your essays. Some of you already started working on your IDs. Okay, and that's fine. Just make sure that you get it done before the due date. And remember that the multiple choice is due by Friday. And I warned you guys in there that if you don't have good internet and you don't have maybe good service, or you're having to use your phone rather than a laptop, you probably want to think about going to the media center and taking you an hour, hour and a half over there to get ready and do it somewhere where you have good Wi-Fi or good, all right, internet, so that you don't flub it up. Okay, so be conscious of that. The IDs, the essays, you can kind of do those on your own. Okay, but that multiple choice, when it sits down and you click into it, the counter starts. Okay, it's just like a test. So if we were in here and I handed it out to you, you'd have that amount of time. Okay, so once you click in there, that counter starts, and you got to get it finished. If you don't, okay, then you know what happens. It'd be like you turning your paper in half blank here. Okay, so be aware of that. Okay, get that done. All right, see you guys.